kick back and relax and not say all that ominous, terrifying shit for a little bit.
She was so beautiful to watch, swirling in and out of view. A seemingly Spanish dancer, hands and heels. A moon-faced girl with eyes downturned. Subtle flesh stirs beneath black and fresh, refined and tempting. So shy and enticing, yet I fear she disappeared before the night ends. Time seems to bring us together again. A decade later in another place. Are you the girl I've been dreaming of? You look like her, you smile like her, that raven-haired beauty of another time. Rush of memories washing over me. I've always been waiting for someone to set me free. Those eyes quietly tell me of the passion we could share. Your dance reminds me of the life we once knew. Snares for my hopes, snares for my thoughts, snares for my dreams, drifting on to oblivion. Can you tell me about the intuition I feel? Can you tell me about everything I love to understand? Remnants of us, deeper purity. Remnants of us, She was so beautiful to watch, drifting on into oblivion. A moon-faced memory with eyes downturned. Are you the one I've been dreaming of?
Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you'd be so kind, would you mind introducing yourselves?
Yes, I'm Sam Rosenthal.
And I am Jon DeRosa.
Sam Rosenthal, Jon DeRosa, thanks for joining me. Both of you guys are involved in a number of projects, but today we'll be talking about Black Tape for a Blue Girl. Sam, would you mind telling me how you describe the music of Black Tape for a Blue Girl? What kind of music would you say you make?
I guess I would probably put it into ethereal darkwave. I think it's done some different sounds over the years. The newest release is maybe a little more neoclassical.
Now, Jon, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
Well, this is my first release or my first time working with, well, actually, not exactly, but it's kind of my first time being involved in sort of the album process with Sam, though I've been listening to Black Tape for a Blue Girl for a really long time. And so I would say that, Sam's pretty accurate about his description there, and definitely that the new album is more in the realm of, there's definite elements of neoclassicism.
What about terms like goth rock or neofolk or some of these other scenes that your music is sometimes associated with? Do you have a problem with any of that?
With Black Tape for a Blue Girl, there's definitely a goth audience for the music. It's always been popular within the goth genre. So I always kind of think goth is who gets included in the goth genre as opposed to having to find some specific goth elements. I think there were things that could have been in the neo-folk sound, but to me, neo-folk is had a lot more of a European creative base. And I don't really think that I'm doing much that would fall into that category, but someone who's a fan of neo-folk quite likely would like the band. So, it overlaps perhaps.
So I should mention that Jon has been on the podcast before. We spoke about his project Arctica a couple years ago. This is Sam's first time, and this is the first time Black Tape is on Dreams of Consciousness. Sam, if you don't mind, would you be able to give a brief history of the band for the people who aren't familiar with you?
Okay, sure. Black Tape for Blue Girl started in 1986 with an album called The Rope that was on vinyl. And around the same time as when my label Project Records sort of started getting a little further into people's consciousness. And when I was making the music, I think 4AD and Brian Eno were probably the two things I was really sort of in league with, let's say, sound-wise. But as you just mentioned a second ago, there was a goth audience who sort of discovered it and felt connection to it. And the album with Jon, The Cleft Serpent, is the 13th album from the band over 38, 35 years, whatever that number is. 13th album, first one that Jon is the vocalist on. And unlike other albums, Jon sings every song on this album. So I feel like this album has a more cohesive sound, which worked out really nice.
So we'll definitely speak more about The Cleft Serpent in a little while. Let's jump to how you and Jon met and how you ended up collaborating.
So when I was, going way, way back, and when I would say like in my early teens, probably I'm thinking like 1992, 93, I first discovered the music of Black Tape for a Blue Girl. I was still, I don't even know if I was even in high school at the time. I was, maybe pre-high school or just starting high school. And I just instantly became a big fan of Project Records, of the label. I was really into the music. And from like a really young age, I was making demos and like sending them to the project office, in my spare time when I was like recording my stuff on a 4-track. And it kind of just like developed this relationship by mail with Sam. And at the time, Pat Ogle, who was also known as Thanatos, records under the name Thanatos. But at that time, Pat was working in the project offices as like doing the booking and promotions and things like that. And so at about age 15, I started getting, I was like pestering Pat and Sam to like open up for project bands when they would come to New York, because in that era, I think that was kind of like right when project bands started really touring and doing shows like that. So I was like living in New Jersey at the time. And, I was like, hey, like, when Love Spirals Downwards comes to New York, like, I can open up. And Pat started, saying sure, and Sam too. So, I was like 15 years old, I think, when I played my first show ever was on a project show with Love Spirals Downwards and Love's Lies Crushing. And anyway, so that's how our relationship started way back then. And flash forward to the present, I guess it was like, we hadn't really been Sam and I hadn't really been too much in touch over the years, but we reconnected, I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago when Steve Roach came to Los Angeles to perform there. And we connected, chatted a bit. And from there, it led to the collaboration that we did together, which was called Eating Rose Petals. And it was, I think, Sam, what was that, from 2020, 19?
19, yeah, to the end of 2019.
So that was a little bit of a collaborative thing we did together, and it worked out so well. And I think we just felt like we were kind of on the same wavelength musically. And when Sam was preparing the new album, The Cleft Serpent, he asked me if I would sing a track on it. And the track went well, and it turned into singing on the whole album. So, and if Sam, you have anything to add to that, that was my my summary.
Oh no, I think
Sam, sorry, just before we get there, before we get to the collaborations, Jon, would you mind telling me what it was about Project Records and Sam's music that appealed to you?
I was, I'm trying to put myself back in that time and place. I mean, I was, probably 15 years old. I was really into metal and darker stuff, but I think this was pretty much pre-internet. It wasn't as easy to find new music or, in the way that we do today. I was getting into goth stuff and, more darker sounds, and really discovering it by hanging out at the local record store and going to other record stores and just really absorbing everything that was out there. And when I'm not exactly sure like how I got turned on to Project, but I remember the first release that I heard was From Across This Gray Land, #3. And I still to this day think it's an amazing compilation because it showcases a lot of different sides of the label. It had a lot of ambient sounds on the second side with Vidna Amana and Steve Roach. And then on the first side, it had a lot more of the gothier and ethereal sounds like Love Spirals Downwards and Black Tape and Thanatos and stuff, Lycia. So I think hearing that for the first time was a little bit like my first exposure to that kind of music. I don't even know if I had been exposed to like 4AD yet. So in that time, it was sort of, it just struck something in me that I was like, oh, wow, this is like a thing that's out there. And I do remember like the visuals of the packaging went so well with the music and the aesthetic. And there was just something about it that was so cohesive and made so much sense to me at the time. And it struck something in me that was like very, innate. It was like very primal, very personal. And it was a connection,
So, Sam, let's talk about the two collaborations that you did with Jon. Eating Rose Petals, can you tell me a little bit more about that release and your contributions to that release?
Yeah, sure. Jon, how do you pronounce the album that track is on?
Variation.
Yes. So Jon released that album, and I loved the album. And then there was this track that just, I could hear where it had elements that I'd be interested in adding to it. I think just that there was something that seemed like they would mesh nicely. And for whatever weird reason, Jon, I had the idea to run the track backwards. I think it was because I wanted to hear the melody without the words. I was just digging the melody. And so it started, I just wanted to run it backwards and play with it and do things with it and see what could be added. And then as we got into it, you re-recorded the melody just sung without the word part. And it was just, I guess it's fun to work on music that I don't have to like think of from scratch, but be able to dive into something that's already conceptualized and sort of touch it and play with it and paint with it. And so it started with just that track, and then we both liked what was happening. So decided to do other things based on the same material to get to that Eating Rose Petal. I think it's 40 minutes long of material.
Yeah, the EP is that long. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was the first thing. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I think that was the next year I did a couple other collaborations. And so there was this period of not working on new Black Tape for Blue Girl material exactly, but wanting to work on music. And it was a way to also get back into working on music. And then I was writing the music for the new album, and I had ideas for the stories for the new album, for what would become the lyrics. And so, like Jon mentioned, I just asked if Jon was interested in trying to sing this track, because we didn't know how it would mesh with you singing my words within my songs. And so, the first track was just sort of an experiment, and it worked out extremely well. So then we said, okay, let's try the next one. So that was sort of the beginning of that getting involved again.
Mm-hmm. Now, Sam, what was it about Jon's vocals or his music that interested you in working with him as a collaborator for Black Tape?
I mean, I think Jon's style has a lot of passion to it that feels very authentic. And it could also be the content of your words, what you're writing, that I sometimes feel my words have a little bit more conceptualization in it, where yours felt like more immediate to me. And so I liked that delivery of things that felt like completely real, where with your listeners might not know, with my band, I write the words and the melodies for the songs, and then I have other people sing them. So people are generally removed from the feeling. They can relate to the feeling, but it wasn't their initiation of it. And so I think one of the things that worked really well with working with Jon is that it still has that immediate passion to it, even though it is removed and gone through the filter of me. But I think I heard that immediately in when I started re-listening again to the work that Jon had done in the different bands you've done.
And Jon, on your end, as somebody who had been a fan of Black Tape and Project Records for a significant amount of time, how did it feel to be working and singing on a Black Tape album?
I mean, it was very cool. I think more than anything, as Sam and I are both older now, it's to sort of like the admiration for me is definitely still there. It's just in such a different way. And when we reconnected in person, like I was saying, when Sam was in town for Steve Roach, I was like, wow, we haven't really talked in 10 or 15 years or something, but in that time, we had a lot in common. We were sort of doing, a lot of the same things in our interests and our explorations and our learning. And so we had a lot to talk about. And it started to, for me, it felt a lot more comfortable. It felt a lot more comfortable because I was like, this is someone that I not only artistically have something in common with, but I feel like we understand each other on another level. But I do remember when we were first talking about doing the collaboration, when Sam had brought up possibly doing the vocals on the Cleft Serpent. I think one of the first things, I don't know I don't know if Sam flat out asked, but he was like, so can you do angry? Or can you do because a lot of my projects are a little bit more I would say there's a little bit more restraint. There's a little bit more sadness. There's a little bit more resignation and vocally that's kind of where I'm comfortable. And as Sam was starting to write the beginnings of the Cleft Serpent, I think he was seeing that there was a lot of peaks and valleys with the emotion in the characters in that he was writing. And, and I was like, I'll try, it's I think I can. So going into it, it was the first time that I did something where I knew that there was a certain level of theater almost. I knew that these were characters and that I needed to be expressive in a way that I hadn't really done that much before. So it was on one hand a challenge, and on one hand I felt very free by it because I was like, well, it's not me really, I'm the serpent now. And in being that, it allowed me to kind of channel a lot of that of myself. And I think that that's kind of why it worked out so well. I think that that's why it felt so good for me, I think it made me think about performance in a way that I hadn't before too.
Like two snakes basking in the setting sun, we watch the birds ride the currents where the hills crash down to the sea. Shivering, he says, you're as cold as ice. Check it and see. His wry smile flickers elegantly. And I was captured some lifetimes ago. This trickster has a trick in store as he plunges the knife. Next life tragic, always tragedy. Plunging, wings almost touch the sea. Snaky, who you talking to? He chokes, coughing up blood. Plunges the knife, takes
So we'll speak a little bit more about the narrative that provides the album its framework and the characters in the album. Let's speak a little bit more about the music. Sam, when you, as you mentioned, the Cleft Serpent is your 13th album. When you began working on this, did you already have a good sense of what kind of music you wanted to make and what direction you wanted the album to go in?
Yeah, actually, when I started thinking about it, which probably wasn't that long after the 2018 album was out, I had an idea for the sound, but I didn't actually have the bandmates to create that sound yet. I just imagined it would have a lot of strings, and I'd been working with a string player, but the person, Henrik, who we eventually found, his emotion and his ability to just make music was right in line with what I wanted to hear on the album. So for quite a while, I had this idea, but no one to do it with. And originally, even before Jon was involved, I had this idea to make some sort of movie where there was a person who acted the character of the serpent, and then the music was instrumental behind them. And then when the pandemic came, and just the time travel ideas just were going to be impossible to do in a certain way. And so making it into lyrics put a singer over the musical idea I had in mind, but I still hadn't recorded yet. And then in 2020, I was working on a electronic collaboration about Timothy Leary, and I asked Henrik, who collaborated with another artist on project, if he wanted to play on a few of those tracks. And what he played, I was like, this is Black Tape for a Blue Girl. What he's playing fits perfectly into the band's sound and the sound I had for this album in mind. So it's kind of like finding the band members who could then do the album I was imagining. And I think I mentioned there's only 3 of us on this album, which Black Tape for a Blue Girl has had often many, many more people in the band on an album. So I really like that it has a very sort of, what's the right word? Hermetic? I'm not sure that's the right word. Sound, where it's very reduced down to an integral group of people instead of some albums. There's 4 vocalists and there's like 12 musicians, and the songs can sound kind of different, from schizophrenic from song to song. So this time it was more coherent.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Henrik? I believe his name is Henrik Maricord.
Yeah. Well, I would have to step back and say the funny thing about this album is none of us recorded together. Jon, is this like the 3rd time we've talked on the phone since we started making the album?
I know.
It's very interesting because in the past people would come and record, or I would go to them and record, and then you hang out and you get coffee and you talk a lot and you get to know each other. And so Henrik's in Sweden and we have never talked on the phone. We've only emailed each other. So I know about him from his Instagram, seeing pictures of him in Sweden. But I find it really interesting not to actually know the people in your band, but they're contributing to it, and they still know the feeling and they are still there.
Jon, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I know Henrik a little bit, probably less than Sam, to be honest, but my interactions with him since we've been working on this together just feel really good. I mean, I think his playing is incredible. I've played with a lot of cellists in my I know that there's a lot of sensitivity involved in Henrik's playing. His tone and his pitch is really spot on, which is something that I notice right away with cellists and string players in general. I've heard other things that he's recorded and posted and things in his other projects. So I just think he's just like one of those special players who's like really good to know. He's very seems very versatile, that you can kind of give him a little bit and he's like, oh yeah, I can do that, and he'll run with it. And again, this is just the sense that I get from talking with Sam and also from the work that we did with Cleft Serpent. To me, that's sort of like the mark of an amazing musician. It involves intuition. He's handling somebody else's music and he's doing what he feels works best for it. And I think he's done a really amazing job.
One of the things was that having the vocals and then the string melody, to not have them fight with each other, at times Henrik's parts would have to get down in the mix to, he plays viola and there's a little bit of violin. So the instruments sometimes could get in the way of the vocals. And so that's why there's a second instrumental disc just where I could like mix his stuff up, change around some of the arrangements and things, just because, the vocals are still the focus. What Jon is doing is the story, but the strings are almost like a third character besides the trickster in the story.
Yeah.
With 3 members in 3 different locations and the 3 of you never actually meeting or practicing together, what was the songwriting process like? How did the album come together?
I said there was maybe 2 or 3 songs that existed before Jon got involved. And I always imagined that I wanted to set up the structure of the song, record the strings, and then pull a bunch of me out of the song. And so I think I would generally send Henrik a 2-track mix and sometimes a click track. I think sometimes not even a click track. And then on perhaps 5, he added his parts before Jon, and then on 3, he added them after. But it was sort of, I would send him, let's just say, a stereo 2-track, and then he would send me back 3 to 8 stereo tracks and sometimes a submix that I would then bring back into the studio and then sort of start playing with volumes or moving this section to over here. If I imagined, that's actually where the vocals are going to go, because when Henrik got many of them, the vocals weren't written yet. So he didn't actually know that spot sort of, needs to tone down a little bit for Jon to fit in there. And then with Black Tape, I wrote the words and I'd record the melody and send that to Jon with the backing track, and the vocals were in the studio. Jon could once you sort of had the placement and the melody, you could cut out my vocals so they wouldn't be distracting when Jon recorded his parts. And then his tracks came back to me, and then it was sort of fitting them all in together and, figuring out usually when I recorded with other vocalists, we'd record bits of the song, but Jon gave me more material to work with where I could kind of like hear different interpretations of a line or a feeling. So because we were in the same place, I could kind of see which of the feelings felt like how I thought that line should go. But I think people have an imagination that bands sit in a room together and all write songs. And certainly there are bands who do it that way, but that's never been my process. It's much more, I guess, I look at it like kind of like a director where you have the talent who then realize the idea you have, but the songs are not written in collaboration all that often.
So most of the music was actually written and sent to Jon and Henrik. Is that correct?
Written in the sense of existing, but not written in the sense of sending, like Henrik. I didn't send him notes to play. It was, here's my music, and then you improvise around that, and then we might decide some spots that need more of a melody. But it wasn't written down or something like that.
Let's talk about the recording just a little bit before we talk about the story behind the album.
Mm-hmm.
Do all 3 of you have your own home studios? I know Jon does. I know Jon does a lot of recording.
I do some recording at home. The vocals for this particular project I recorded with my friend, producer Charles Newman. I worked with him for probably 20 years. He's done a lot of the Arctica records. And for many of those years, either I was in New York and he was in LA, or I was in LA and he was in New York. We kind of tended to change places. But in the past couple of years, we've both been in LA. He lives in Encino. He lives, 10 or 15 minutes away. So it's awesome. And so for this project, Charles is just a little bit more, he records vocals really well, and he has really great gear. And so for this particular project, I worked over at his studio. And so like Sam was saying, Sam would send what he had, and I would set up with Charles and basically record. I wanted to stay really faithful to what Sam was giving me in terms of his vocal melodies. But there were times where I was like, you know what, I'm going to try something else here. I'm going to add a thing here. And I gave him I was like, here you go. And I think for Sam, it was nice to have some choices in some of the stuff. And for me, it felt good too, because I was like, well, if this one doesn't work, then this is going to work. So I think it also made me feel a little bit more at ease to provide some different options. And I think for the most part, it worked pretty well throughout the whole process like that.
Sam, do you have anything you want to add about the actual recording?
Yeah, I mean, one of the advantages of having the multiple takes is sometimes there was just enough variation where it could become like a backing track, backing vocal. Just on some words, there's places where there's, just a slightly different note or slightly different timing or something. So it's a way to get some. I think that happened probably more in the Cleft Serpent and Trickster, the first couple songs, where there's some backing vocals that came that way. And yeah, I mean, it was really an unknown to have Jon record. So, we did the first track and we were both like, wow, that's great. That's working. So, it was like, okay, this process is definitely functional. So let's move on. And I think stepping back to what you said a little earlier also, Jon, was I think there was a point where you kind of went, it kind of made sense that, oh, okay, I'm this character. I can do these sort of what maybe felt over the top or campy-ish kind of performances, but within the context of like that word having that energy or this line being more sarcastic or whatever, which was different than what you would do on your own.
Yeah, and I think we had that. I think we had a long phone conversation about it, and Sam's. It was almost like him out like. The best way I could describe it is doing the vocals was like Sam was like, this is the world that he created. It was kind of a, to me, it felt, my only reference was like an opera. Like it felt operatic in terms of the sense of the characters, and there was a struggle and there was a conflict. And, so I was approaching it in that way because that was kind of how I was understanding it. But I do remember having long conversations with Sam about, so like, what's the, and again, I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but, so like, what's the story with this? What, who, like, I was really wanting to know motivation. And as Sam said, that was the thing that I really wasn't sure about in the very beginning was like, do I sing this? If I was singing this as Jon DeRosa, this might be a little bit different. To know it was coming from a character who had a certain story or a backstory and a certain edge in certain ways really allowed me to be a little bit more expressive and have a little bit more like fun with the delivery and sort of the tone, and there's subtle things. And so I think once I accepted that, it all got a lot easier for me, because in the beginning I was like, well, how does this work? Like I'm sort of almost like guest singing on an album, but I want it to be my voice, but and I had to sort of figure out how that would be. So the finished product was very much kind of like, I definitely feel like it's me, and I definitely feel like it's doing the character justice as well. So yeah, but those were some of those talks that Sam and I had on the phone leading, like in the recording process.
And Jon, do you think now that you hear it, you're like, oh, I get where he was going from the beginning now, where maybe on Cleft Serpent you didn't at the time.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because it's not, I mean, look, it's not a typical like album where it's like, hey, do you want to do vocals on my record? And like, you do what you do. It's like, to me, this is a story. There's characters involved. There's, and it wasn't sort of something I saw right away. But like, again, I think after those talks where we really got in depth about some of the lyrics and some of the, the emotion behind it, I definitely started to feel like I understood the universe of the album more, and it helped me like let go of some of the hangups I had, or like, the sort of fears I had about, is this going to be me impersonating someone? Is this going to be, and in the end, it's, something I'm really proud of. I think it came out amazingly well.
destroy the one who once saved me in order to avoid airless plummets from my grasp. I didn't try to stop myself. Fear rallied my anger, my self-importance. On my knees, search among the piles of bodies. Did I imagine you? Did I imagine you? I want you to be real, to wash away my pain, to wash away this shame.
Let's talk about the story and the narrative behind the album. Sam, can you tell me a little bit about the two characters that you mentioned, the Serpent and the Trickster?
Sure. So my idea was that the main character at some point in time got stuck in a loop of something called samsara, which is we come back again and again to karmically deal with our unresolved things or something like that. I mean, I didn't stick to the total legit Eastern translation of this. I just have this character who, in my mind, he suddenly finds himself in a life that he might be 50 years in, he might be 30 years in, but he's sort of, instead of when you reach enlightenment in your life, he reaches that point and realizes, oh, I am here again. And he is either causing problems or interacting with the other character, the Trickster, who might be causing him problems, or they're causing each other problems. And it's kind of like how many people, they find themselves in the same relationship again. And they're like, why am I here again? Why am I doing these things again? But his is on a much more cosmic scale because it's happened over thousands of years that they return to have this dynamic between the two of them. So, I mean, in a way, it's like a time travel story. And in the way, I mean, it might have come from a vampire story because I think about vampires who are living forever and they'd be worn down by time. They'd be just so done with it, you know, after 1,000 years of going through this and losing their partners and losing whatever they loved and whatever they had. And so all of that sort of angst was sort of put into this character we meet him at the point where he's pretty worn down by having to continuously repeat this process.
And is that the character of the Serpent?
That's the Serpent character, but I do think that in many ways they mesh together. He sometimes is the one who's affected by the more powerful Trickster character in that life. But to me, the Trickster character isn't aware until at some point in the story that he is interacting again with the Serpent character. There was one song, I think it was The Trickster, where when I wrote it, I thought one character was singing it. And then for a while, I thought maybe it's the other character. And then I figured, well, maybe they're both singing parts of it just because they do have some overlap of their issues or the things that happen.
With these characters in this narrative, and Jon, I believe you described this album as being operatic. Would you say the album tells a story from beginning to end?
Oh yeah. It's definitely a narrative through the album of the first track. The Serpent introduces himself and sort of the situation. The second track, where's the third track? Which one's the Trickster now? The Trickster, the second track, is the second character sort of telling his story. And I feel like the end of each lyric sort of instigates the action which begins or is the next lyric, the next song. And Aries and Hermes is much more of like this sort of about these gods in conflict, but they're really still the same characters. They're still the serpent and the trickster, just in a different existence. And the sort of the much more large battle. And then in the matchmaker, at that point, it's really the serpent against humanity in a way, where it's just about, I guess, humans unable to leave things alone and always just making matters worse because they can't just sit with reality and just their anxieties in the situation. And then in the final track, there's sort of, most of the tracks, someone dies in it, but in the final track is sort of, there's the finale of what happens to the characters.
Now, is this a complete narrative, or is there a possibility for there to be a sequel to this?
There's a possibility of that. The previous album, To Touch the Milky Way, had 2 songs, the first and last track, which were, to me, part of this story already. And so the story could never be complete just because the character goes back to what I call the void, and he's just sort of in limbo there, knowing he's going to come back into another life. And I guess the resolution to his entire story would be if he stopped going through the recycle. But it is possible that there's more to be said.
Jon, let's talk about your performance and inhabiting these characters. You mentioned that aspects of this performance were not how you usually sing or perform vocals, and that you had to get into character, so to speak. Did you feel like you were inhabiting these characters, or that you had to somehow get into the personality of these characters before you perform vocals on the album?
I mean, I think, I'm not an actor and I haven't done acting, and, but I'm interested by it, and I've, read books and listened to interviews, and the process for me felt akin to what I would imagine an actor would feel like entering a role where you're talking to a director and saying, so like, what's the motivation of my character? Where is he coming from? Like, what is this anger? Is he, and so I think a big part of the way I approached each song was trying to understand the motivation. And to be honest, I didn't fully get it in the beginning. I was like sort of on board. I sort of understood it, but there's a little bit of like a complexity in the story. And again, there were a couple conversations where we really got in depth about what was going on and like who these characters were and what were the events that were transpiring. And, for me, that allowed me to approach each song with a certain understanding. And I'll also add that, the way that Sam writes lyrics has always been very descriptive, still very, personal but very in this particular project, they were very much, I would say, more in detail and more in depth than anything that I have written and sung in the past. And so in a way, in some songs, I felt like it was my role as like, to narrate the action of the story in addition to like what I was doing. And in that way is why I feel it was theatrical or operatic and once again, it was like, I think that when you inhabit a role, whether it's as an actor or as a theater person or something, you sort of let go a little bit of your ego, you let go a little bit of yourself, but at the same time, you're bringing yourself into the role. So I think that was just the thing I had to figure out because I'd never really done it before. There was only one, and now that I'm talking about it, there was one other time where I sang a theater type release, and that was an album that Stephen Merritt from the Magnetic Fields released called Show Tunes. And it was like a Chinese opera that he had updated and translated. And it was much, much lighter than what we did on the Cleft Serpent. And I was also much, much younger. And when I listened back to Show Tunes, I clearly wasn't, I think it's an amazing release. I just wasn't as much inhabiting the character, I think, as I could now as a little bit of an older person who's a little bit maybe more comfortable in my skin and stuff. But in any event, there were certainly elements of having to understand motivation, having to understand character, having to understand story that came with singing on the album.
Now, were either of these two characters more natural for you to perform?
You know, it's funny because the songs that I was a little bit more apprehensive going in are the ones now in the end that I'm the most pleased with. There's one called Ares and Hermes that's like very like bombastic, like almost like a war anthem. And there's a lot of like bravado and like, you know, power. And I was like, I don't know, like if I can, you know, if I have this, if I, you know, and that was one of the vocals that went, you know, so smoothly where it just was like, it clicked. So I think that in some ways, and then there was the other track. Is it the Trickster, Sam, that starts with like two snakes? Like two snakes. And we have to look it up. There's also songs that are, yeah, the Trickster.
Yeah.
There's also songs that are so much more gentle that felt closer to my heart in terms of what I might sing as myself. And that was also like a beautiful feeling and like a comforting feeling. Like I was really able to imbue the character with something that was personal. So I would say there's like both ends of the spectrum, you know, even the ones that were very much felt out of character for me, Jon DeRosa, I ended up finding a kind of a way into them. And then there was those ones that felt like I could, you know, release it on an album of my own under my own name. And that felt really good too. So, yeah.
And then at the end of Ares and Hermes, it comes down to this really sort of soft and hurt section. So you go out of the bombast into this very touching area. And, you know, you've got them both in there and it's working really nice. And then the track before that, Hidden Villa, I always thought of it as kind of like Mark Allman from Soft Cell and his most like sort of over the top melodramatic storyline, but it was finding the right tone for your delivery. But there were certain like words that I had an idea how you should hit it, and you hit it differently. And they very much entertained me because they still got the same sort of feeling in them, you know, you still got the emotion, even though you delivered it in a different way than I had suggested. So,
yeah. And I think Hidden Villa is the most overt in terms of like the character coming out. Like he's like sarcastic, you know, there's like, he's like oozing with this sort of like swagger, and there's, you know, and that was like, I think that was like one of those ones where I was like, how do I make this like mine, but still be faithful to, you know, so that was a challenge, but I think, again, I think it is one of the more entertaining tracks on the album for sure.
So we're talking about characters, we're talking about a narrative, we're talking about motivation. Would either of you guys describe this album as a concept album?
I would say yes. I had one in 2002 that I called a concept album, but I never quite completely figured out the connection of that one story. I knew they all fit together, but this one, there definitely was a concept and characters who continue throughout and the story. And, Jon didn't have to deal with this part of the album where it's like, I can't remember which song. I'm the One That Loses. I think had like 23 different versions of the lyrics before I finally got to what I wanted to say with it. And there's this, sometimes things come right out, and sometimes it's supposed to do this certain thing, and it's honing it down until it's doing that thing. And what I tried to do with the lyrics is not make them feel overworked, but it is a process to get them to say what needs to be said in that spot. So I do feel, I can map the flow how after To Touch the Milky Way, where the character is left, the serpent leaves the broken trickster in the battlefield. And then the next song, the serpent is just sort of wishing he could stop doing this, wishing this process would end, wishing he hadn't made the bet or the deal or whatever that got him into this life of repetition. And so, it comes down and down into the darkest, most resigned point in that track. And then it starts coming up in the next one, The Matchmaker, which, he's more of just doesn't care and he's going to destroy things, and that leads it into the end of the album. So I do see it like, it has a screenplay, it has plot points, and it has where it's going on that path.
Jon, how do you feel about concept albums?
I mean, in general, or, because, it depends on the concept, really. I think that, that sometimes concept albums are a tough sort of medium if the story's not there, if the performance isn't there, if it's a bit more of like a vanity project, so I don't know if I have an opinion one way or the other about them in general. I think when it's a good concept and the performances are great and the lyrics are good and all of that, I think that they can be amazing.
Yeah, and I think the songs also, they work each on their own. It's not like without everything else, that song isn't working at all. And so, they can get played as a single track on Spotify and they still work as a song and they work as a piece.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. For the listener who comes to one of these songs on Spotify, as you mentioned, or YouTube or whatever, can they still enjoy these songs individually, or, not knowing the narrative, not knowing the story behind them?
Yeah, I think so for sure. And I also think it's been pretty, I don't know. I mean, Sam would probably have a better read on this, but like from what I've seen, the people, like everyone has like different favorite tracks on this record. It seems like there's not like one where everybody's like, oh, that's the one. It seems like every email we've gotten or message we've gotten has been like, expressing someone's favoritism about, different tracks. And that's, to me, I love that, because that goes to show that there's just something to like and in all of it.
Yeah, I think, as an artist, I would have my more favorite track on the album. And then someone said, this one's their favorite. I'm like, that one? Really? Okay, cool. I mean, I didn't expect that track to be the one. So it is, it's great that way that it works. I think also Black Tape for a Blue Girl usually has at least one song that is more poppy, whatever that means in my genre, The Stars on the last album or Remnants of a Deeper Purity on that album. And this one didn't really have a song that was the obvious, more accessible track. And so there wasn't a track that like I, as the label, was pushing as this is the song people were more likely to like. So it just kind of left it open for people to gravitate towards whichever one.
So the Cleft Serpent is the 13th album by Black Tape for a Blue Girl. Sam, Jon, what's the best way for people to order this album? How can they get it?
So if they're looking for physical, blacktapeforabluegirl.com is our website, but blacktapeforabluegirl.bandcamp.com is the store where they can buy it. And there's cassette and there's mini disc. The LP is supposed to be here later this month. And there's the CD. Project Records has project.com, project with a K. And of course it's, Spotify and Pandora and Bandcamp. People can listen to it there.
You mentioned the instrumental version of the album. Do you want to say anything else about that?
Yeah. Over the last few years, I've really gotten into LP length albums. I think that I like the format restriction that says, put your idea into this length of time. And so the goal pretty much was to have 8 songs on this album. But like I said, I enjoyed the instrumental material without Jon's vocals just because things had to be, put in the mix right so you could understand the vocals and you could hear Jon. So it was kind of with the Kickstarter, which is how we crowdfunded the album. The second disc was going to be the bonus for the backers, the first plan for it. So it has each track instrumental. It has 2 additional instrumentals that aren't on the album, 3 early mixes, and I think 3 mixes where I brought the vocals back into the now changed instrumental versions. So they're the instrumental versions with vocals. So the bonus album is a longer album. How many tracks is it on there? It's 16 songs on the bonus album. But it's really for the people who find it through the band's website. It's not in distribution. But it's up digitally where it can be heard anywhere. And so this is the first time that I've had an entire instrumental album of the album. Some people have asked for it over time, but this is the first one I've done. And I think also the process of recording the album was to get this idea very specifically right. But with the instrumentals, it was kind of like freeing to just like, okay, now I'm going to do something different with this material. It was sort of like having fun after the very focused edit to get the album together.
Do you want to say anything about the physical versions and the bundles that you have on sale through the Bandcamp page?
Yeah, physical objects are very much a fetish object at this point, where digital is really the way the music world is headed. But the band, every release is back for the crowdfunder, and there's definitely people who are still really into the objects. And so I enjoy being able to make them deluxe and have it. I'm not sure if it's a 16 or 20 page booklet in this one, but yeah, so there's like the CD and there's the bonus CD. And actually people have been asking about mini discs, which are this old format. It's like a little, sort of like an audio hard drive. And so I did those this time just for some of the backers who wanted that. And then the LP, and that's the reason to do a 8-song album, so that you can put it on an LP, fit it on that format. Cause I love how they look. I love how, colored vinyl, and the quality of vinyl today is so amazing. They sound so rich. So, it's nice to be able to do the different formats. And, with the world going digital, there's definitely people who still want these different formats. So it's nice to be able to give those.
And if people want to follow you guys online, what's the best way to do that?
Jon?
So you can go to Arctica, which is spelled AARKTICA.com, or arctica.bandcamp.com, and that has, all of my releases, my personal releases as Arctica. I also have, this year I have a lot planned for Arctica in regard to some reissues, some remastered versions of older albums, hoping to do some vinyl releases of some of the early albums, specifically the first album, No Solace in Sleep. So I'm slowly starting to make some, reconnect with a lot of the folks that have been supportive over the years. Even though it's not an ideal medium, I find that Facebook is still something I use for connecting with Arctica fans. So if you are on Facebook, you can just search for Arctica. Once again, it's like AARKTICA. And there is also where I'll be posting a lot about the up and coming releases, different projects I'm doing this year. And, also you can just search Arctica and Google or whatever, because I think I'm the only one spelled that way. But all the releases for Arctica are also available on Spotify and Bandcamp and all of that. So it's all out there right now.
Now, Jon, do you also have a social media page under your own name, a musician page under Jon DeRosa?
Yeah, I do. So if you were to search my name too, you could find me there on Facebook. You could find me at jonderosa.com. It's Jon without an H, so it's just Jon. And yeah, and those are, as I get older, those, I think for a while I was kind of like, had a little bit of like split personalities with doing different things. But as I get older and as my focus starts to come into clarity more, I think that those things will start to converge a bit more as elements of each one start to be shared. So yeah, anyone who wants to find me can find me that way.
And Sam, how can people follow Black Tape and Project Records online?
Yeah, blacktapeforabluegirl.com has the links to Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Project is spelled with a K, and it's project.com. And that has links to Twitter as well. Personally, I like Instagram the best. I find it, it's the most fun website because it's really visual. I like seeing what people are up to. I like sharing just pictures from the past or what's going on today. But there's all the different ones. And yeah, there's projectrecords.bandcamp.com or blacktapeforbluegirl.bandcamp.com. And yeah, or just, Google it and you'll find it. It's on all the different Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes. And yeah, and Black Tape for Blue Girl is going to be soon crowdfunding a reissue of A Chaos of Desire, which is 31 years old this year. So it's going to be a 2 LP, a CD release.
Is there anything else you guys want to say?
Thanks for the interview. I mean, it's great getting to talk with you. And also, I like seeing Jon and talking with Jon because we don't do it much. So that's cool.
Yeah, I'll have to agree with that. And hopefully, I do hope to make it up to Portland to visit Sam at some point soon because, I do think that part of the fun of making music together is the hanging out and the interaction, the conversations and stuff. So getting to do stuff like this too is also really, really fun. And yeah, I appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much.
All right. Thanks. Take care, man. And bye, Sam. See you soon.
Thank you.